So could the insights of Aldous Huxley on this perennial philosophy and William James's look at religious experiences, plus the concept of God itself, and then this newer framework, analytic idealism,
Hmm.
could they actually give us a richer understanding of the divine than just, one perspective alone?
That's a really fascinating question, isn't it? How these quite different lines of thought coming from different places and times might actually converge or shed light on something as complex and, well, fundamental as God.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, this deep dive is really about trying to weave those threads together. Think of it as um, a focused look, pulling out the key connections, the potential synergies, maybe saving you a bit of the heavy lifting of reading all the sources separately.
Right. We want to see what insights pop out when you put them side by side.
Exactly. How do they build a more nuanced picture of, well, the divine?
And looking at the sources we have, it's quite a range. You've got Huxley's The Perennial Philosophy, which is this broad sweep across cultures looking for mystical unity.
Hmm.
Then William James, The Varieties of Religious Experience, diving deep into the very personal individual encounters and their psychological side.
And analytic idealism?
Yes, the idea that consciousness isn't just something the brain does, but that it's the basic stuff of reality.
Quite a radical idea for some.
Definitely. And the common thread we're tracing through all of this is how they approach or illuminate the concept of God.
Okay, so our mission today is basically to explore how these three perspectives, Huxley's perennial philosophy, James's analysis, analytic idealism, how they intersect, and maybe contribute something unique to understanding God using only the ideas presented in these specific materials. Let's start with Huxley. What are the core ideas there about God?
Well, at its heart, Huxley's perennial philosophy argues for a single, timeless truth underlying all the major religious and mystical paths. He pulls from everywhere, really, but emphasizes things like the Upanishads, the idea that the self, the Atman, is that, Brahman.
Brahman being the ultimate reality.
The ultimate reality, the ground of all being. It points to this inherent divinity within us, a fundamental unity beneath all the surface differences.
And he outlines ways to actually grasp this, a sort of path.
He talks about a threefold path. Yeah. One is introspection, looking within yourself. Another is seeing the external world as a manifestation of this divine ground.
So finding divinity in nature, for instance.
Kind of, yes. And the third path is tradition, the wisdom passed down through religions and mystical teachings. But, and this is crucial, he warns against clinging only to tradition.
Right. He quotes Shankara about it being an iron chain. Potentially, it's just intellectual belief without personal experience.
Exactly. It needs that personal realization. It's not enough just to read about it or accept the dogma. There has to be a balance between the received wisdom and your own direct encounter with it.
So this perennial aspect, it suggests these truths are always available, not just historical artifacts.
That's the idea. He points out how some traditions, like in India, viewed their scriptures not as one-time revelations, but as eternal gospels, timeless truths, almost like principles of reason. Aristotle had a somewhat similar view on fundamental religious truths being everlasting.
Okay, now Huxley brings in this idea, quoting someone, that our lives, our minds, have their very being through God. And the whole point is to return to this eternity of the ground. He even makes a distinction between God and Godhead. Can you unpack that a bit?
That's a really key distinction, yeah. God, in this sense, often relates to the more personal deity we find in many religions, the creator, the one you have a relationship with, who acts in the world.
The God of Abraham, perhaps.
Could be seen that way, yes. But the Godhead is something deeper, more fundamental. It's the ultimate, undifferentiated source, pure being beyond all concepts, infinite.
So almost beyond personality.
Infinitely beyond personality, beyond any description, and the idea that God undergoes becoming, while the Godhead is immutable, suggests a dynamic aspect to the divine as it interacts with creation, while the ultimate source remains unchanging.
Interesting. And Huxley stresses love as a way to know this reality, sometimes even more than thinking. He quotes, "God is love," and that line from The Cloud of Unknowing about love being the key.
Yes, that's central to the perennial philosophy. It emphasizes a kind of selfless contemplation. Knowing God isn't just an intellectual exercise, it's a transformation of your whole being, moving towards that unity. And love is seen as the energy or the attitude that enables that connection, that melts away the ego.
Which connects to the idea of inner purity, right? Having a single motive to please God leads to simple, natural goodness, kind of like some Christian ideals of the inner life.
Absolutely. Huxley brings in William Law, who insisted that just studying theology is no substitute for the actual experience, the birth of God within, practice over theory, essentially.
Keeps going back to experience.
It does, and interestingly, Huxley suggests that even people who aren't formally religious, maybe poets, nature lovers, artists, they might get glimpses of this reality too.
How so?
Through moments of intense aesthetic experience or connection with nature, they might touch upon that deeper unity. But, he suggests, maybe they don't fully grasp it because it requires a more complete selflessness, a more dedicated spiritual practice, perhaps.
So it's like seeing the same landscape, but from different vantage points, maybe some clearer than others.
That's a good analogy. And then there's the influence of mystics like Meister Eckhart. Eckhart's idea that time, our physical bodies, and seeing the world as many separate things, these actually block our direct knowing of God.
I need to transcend them.
Or experience them differently, Eckhart suggests. See the unity behind the multiplicity, experience time within eternity somehow. It's about shifting perception to grasp the underlying oneness.
Which sounds a lot like the Upanishadic view you mentioned earlier, that self-realization isn't possible without giving up vice, getting self-control, finding inner peace. Learning alone isn't enough.
Exactly. You need that inner purification. Your mind has to be calm and focused, not distracted by desires or worldly attachments, to be able to perceive that subtle reality. Intellect helps, but it can't do the job alone.
And Huxley also touches on Buddhism, the idea of the soul reaching union with the divine ground after death.
Yes, the concept of the thus gone soul achieving nirvana or complete union, merging back into the source. It's another expression of that ultimate goal of returning to unity found across different traditions.
He also mentions prayer, through Augustine Baker, as a crucial act for seeking God.
Right. Baker saw prayer as the highest, most perfect action of a rational soul. It's the act of seeking, the turning towards the divine that's necessary.
And what about suffering? How does the perennial philosophy handle that, given this perfect ground?
Well, the idea presented is that the Godhead, being perfect and unified, is impassible, it doesn't suffer. Suffering arises from imperfection, from separation, from being fragmented and alienated from that ultimate ground.
So suffering is a consequence of our distance from the source.
In this view, yes. It's part of the condition of multiplicity and temporality. And finally, Huxley notes how something like Zen Buddhism, coming from Buddha's direct teaching, and mysticism, often emerging from scriptures, can be seen as complementary paths.
Different routes to maybe the same mountaintop.
That's the implication, yes. Different methods, different languages, but potentially pointing towards the same ultimate understanding or experience.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and bring in William James, his Varieties of Religious Experience. How does his approach add to this picture of God? It feels quite different from Huxley's broad sweep.
It is quite different, yeah. James is much more focused on the individual, the psychological. One of his absolutely crucial contributions is distinguishing between existential judgments and spiritual judgments.
Meaning?
Existential judgments are about the facts, what happened in the experience, where it might have come from, maybe even its physiological correlates. Spiritual judgments are about its value, its meaning, its impact on the person's life.
And he says we shouldn't confuse the two.
Exactly. He strongly argues that even if a religious experience has, say, neurological or psychological origins that look pathological, that doesn't automatically invalidate its spiritual significance or the positive changes it might bring about in someone's life.
Which fits his whole pragmatic philosophy, doesn't it? He uses that phrase, by their fruits you shall know them.
Precisely. He adopts, along with Maudsley, this empiricist criterion. Judge the belief or experience by how it works in the long run. What are its practical consequences for how someone lives, for their character? That's the real test, not where it came from.
So less about the objective truth of the experience, more about its subjective effect.
Very much so. And he's cautious about defining religious sentiment as one single thing. He sees it as a label for a whole collection of emotions: awe, fear, love, joy, but all directed towards what the person perceives as divine or sacred objects.
No single God-shaped hole in the brain, then.
Not in James's view, no. It's more complex than that.
Yeah.
He also makes an interesting point about religious happiness. It's not just feeling good or escaping suffering.
How does he define it differently?
He observes that it often involves an inward overcoming of hardship, even a consent to suffering as a kind of sacrifice. It's a deeper, more resilient kind of happiness than just, things going well externally.
That sounds quite profound. He also brings in Kant, interestingly.
Yes, the idea that even if concepts like God can't be proven empirically, like scientific facts, they can still have immense practical meaning. Kant argued we can act as if God exists, and this possibility shapes our moral life, gives it a certain foundation.
So belief has a function, even without proof.
A crucial function for our practical reason and moral compass in Kant's view, which James finds relevant. And James acknowledges, quite straightforwardly, that happiness is a major human driver. Religion, for many, offers a path to a kind of supernatural happiness, especially, he notes, when ordinary life feels unsatisfactory or unhappy.
Makes sense. People turn to religion often in times of need.
And he thinks the core of religious life often revolves around the individual's deep concern with their own personal destiny. Questions of meaning, purpose, life after death. And the divine, as experienced, often seems to meet people right there, addressing those very personal concerns.
It's not just abstract theology for most people.
Not at all. And because religion deals with these ultimate personal concerns, which James considers the most real things we know directly, he concludes it's bound to play an enduring role in human history. It's not going away.
He also talks about mystical states, right? How does he view those?
He notes that for the person having the mystical experience, it often feels incredibly authoritative, like a direct perception of fact, a state of knowledge, even though their ordinary senses might be shut down or providing different information.
So it feels like truth to the experiencer.
Intensely so. And he contrasts this with theology. Theology tries to use reason to build arguments that should convince everyone, universally. But historically, he observes, theology ends up creating different schools and sects, just like different kinds of feeling or mystical paths do.
So reason doesn't necessarily lead to universal agreement either.
Apparently not, in practice. James suggests that personal experience remains primary. You can't just substitute belief in formulas or doctrines for that direct, felt connection.
And how does he define the God people connect with in these experiences? Is it the Godhead of Huxley?
Well, Jones observes that the God of the ordinary person is typically conceived as some kind of ideal power they feel connected to. Often, yes, assumed to be the one and only God, maybe infinite, powerful, personal. But, James notes, the actual experience, the raw data of religious feeling, mostly just testifies to a sense of union with something larger than the individual self. It doesn't necessarily come with all the specific theological baggage or proofs of infinity or singularity attached.
So the core experience is connection with something more, and the labels come later.
That's a fair summary of his empirical observation. The feeling of connection is primary. The specific theological interpretations often follow.
Okay, this actually provides a really interesting bridge to analytic idealism. This is a more contemporary philosophical viewpoint. How does it fit in, especially regarding God?
It's a fascinating and, for many, a counterintuitive perspective. The absolute core idea of analytic idealism is that phenomenal consciousness, subjective experience itself, is the only thing in nature that isn't reducible to something else. It's fundamental.
As opposed to matter being fundamental.
Exactly. Physicalism or materialism assumes matter is fundamental, and consciousness somehow emerges from complex arrangements of matter, like brains. Analytic idealism flips that. Consciousness is primary, and the physical world is something that appears within consciousness.
Like a representation.
Precisely. Often the analogy used is a dashboard or a computer interface. The physical world we perceive, tables, chairs, stars, our own bodies, isn't the underlying reality itself, but a representation of it, presented to consciousness within consciousness.
Oh, wow. Okay, so if reality is fundamentally mental, what does that mean for concepts like meaning?
Well, if reality is consciousness, then meaning, which is inherently a mental phenomenon, isn't something we impose on a meaningless universe. It's potentially woven into the fabric of reality itself. The physical world then becomes significant because it points to that deeper conscious ground.
And how does God fit into this picture?
In this framework, God can be understood not as a being separate from the universe, but as the underlying universal consciousness itself, the ground of all being, the singular subjectivity within which everything unfolds. We perceive it only indirectly through the representations on our dashboard.
So it resonates strongly with Huxley's ground.
There's a definite resonance, yes. Both point to a fundamental, unified reality that underlies everything. Analytic idealism tries to arrive there through rigorous philosophical argument and interpretation of empirical evidence, questioning whether a world outside consciousness is even coherent.
But wait, if there's only one universal consciousness, how come we all feel like separate individuals? I feel like me, you feel like you.
That's the big question, right? Analytic idealism explains this through the concept of dissociation. It draws an analogy with dissociative identity disorder, where a single psyche can manifest different personalities or alters, each with its own sense of self, memories, characteristics.
So we are like alters of cosmic consciousness.
That's the analogy used, yes. The idea is that the universal consciousness can undergo a process of segmentation or dissociation, creating apparently separate centers of subjective experience, which are our individual minds.
We're like islands, but the seabed connects us all.
That's a good way to put it. We appear separate on the surface, on the dashboard, a physical representation, our separate bodies. But at the fundamental level of consciousness itself, there isn't necessarily that absolute separation. It's like we're characters sharing a kind of dream, as some proponents put it.
Okay, that's a major conceptual shift. How does this view handle the brain? We usually think the brain creates consciousness.
Analytic idealism suggests the opposite. Consciousness creates the appearance of the brain as part of its self-representation. The brain, as perceived, is the image of certain processes within consciousness. It doesn't generate consciousness. It's what certain conscious processes look like from a particular point of view.
And there's evidence cited for this.
Proponents point to things like psychedelic research, where complex experiences often correlate with reduced overall brain activity, which is hard to explain if the brain is generating the richness of the experience.
Less activity, more experience. Seems backward from materialism.
Exactly. Also, near-death experiences reports of vivid experiences during cardiac arrest when brain function is minimal or absent. Or studies using transcranial magnetic stimulation that can induce out-of-body experiences alongside reduced brain function. These are seen as challenging the brain as generator model.
What about the unconscious mind? Where does that fit if everything is consciousness?
The view here is that the unconscious isn't a separate realm devoid of experience. It's simply parts of phenomenal consciousness that are not currently accessible to our particular center of awareness, our egoic self. They are dissociated or lack self-reflective metaconsciousness, but they are still experiential at some level.
And this differs from other ideas like panpsychism, the idea that even tiny particles have some consciousness.
Yes, analytic idealism critiques what's called bottom-up panpsychism. It raises the combination problem. How do billions of tiny, simple consciousnesses combine to create my rich, unified experience? It seems you need a unified field first.
You can't just add up little bits of awareness and get a Beethoven symphony experience.
That's the difficulty, it points out. Analytic idealism proposes a top-down model. Start with universal consciousness and explain individual minds via dissociation, which avoids the combination problem. It starts with the unified experiencer.
And dissociation helps explain why I can't read your thoughts.
Exactly. Dissociation creates boundaries, private phenomenal fields within the universal mind. There's empirical evidence cited here too, like cases of DD, where different alters in the same body show different physiological responses, like vision correlating with brain activity changes, suggesting a real separation at the level of experience tied to the physical representation.
So perception isn't seeing reality directly. You mentioned Hoffman's interface theory.
Right. The idea is that evolution shaped our perception not for accuracy about the underlying reality, but for fitness, for survival and reproduction. So what we perceive is more like a useful icon on a desktop representing something complex underneath, rather than the thing itself.
So the tree I see isn't the real tree in the cosmic mind, but a useful symbol for interacting with whatever that process is.
That's the idea. And living organisms themselves, with their metabolism, their bodies, their brains, these are seen as the outward appearance, the image on the dashboard of these cosmic level dissociative processes within the universal consciousness.
Okay. Wow. So let's try to pull these threads together now. We have Huxley's ground, James's focus on experiences of something larger, and analytic idealism's universal consciousness. Where do they meet, overlap, or maybe even reinforce each other concerning God?
Well, the overlap seems pretty striking in some areas, doesn't it? Huxley's concept of the divine ground and analytic idealism's fundamental universal consciousness both point toward this underlying unified reality as the source of everything. They're using different languages, different methods, but the destination looks remarkably similar.
A single source reality.
Yes. And James's work, focusing on the experience of connecting with something larger than ourselves, fits quite naturally into this. From an analytic idealist viewpoint, James was documenting subjective encounters with this very universal consciousness, or at least glimpses of it, filtered through individual psychology and cultural context.
So James provides the experiential data that the other two frameworks try to explain philosophically or metaphysically.
You could certainly see it that way. Another key convergence point is the limitation of pure intellect. Huxley, through the mystics, emphasizes direct experience beyond thought. James values the practical fruits of belief over theological proofs. And analytic idealism suggests the fundamental reality is consciousness itself, accessed potentially through shifts in consciousness, not just through reasoning about external data.
So all three, in their own way, push beyond just rationalism to understand the divine.
They seem to, yes. They highlight the role of direct experience, intuition, love, or the nature of consciousness itself as being crucial, not just logical deduction based on sensory perception of a physical world.
Consciousness is really the linchpin here, isn't it?
It absolutely seems to be. For Huxley, it's the inner realization within consciousness. For James, it's the subjective quality of conscious experience that matters. And for analytic idealism, consciousness is the ground floor of reality. Understanding God becomes intrinsically linked to understanding consciousness.
What does this synthesis imply for how we think about our own experiences, maybe those moments that feel spiritual or transcendent?
Well, it might encourage us to take them more seriously, perhaps, not necessarily accepting every interpretation at face value, but seeing them as potentially genuine encounters with the deeper layer of reality, with that universal consciousness or ground. James validated the subjective power of these experiences, and Huxley and analytic idealism provide frameworks where such encounters make sense as contacts with fundamental reality.
It opens up possibilities beyond just seeing them as brain chemistry glitches.
Definitely. Though, of course, the synthesis isn't a final answer. It raises huge further questions. What is the precise nature of this universal consciousness? How does dissociation really work? What's the exact relationship between the one and the many?
So it's a framework, but not a closed system.
Exactly. It offers a potentially richer, more integrated way to think about God, drawing on mysticism, psychology, and contemporary philosophy, but it certainly invites much more exploration.
Okay, so to wrap this up for our listeners, what are the key things to maybe take away from this deep dive?
I think one key thing is that the concept of God, or the divine, isn't just one single idea. It can be approached from really diverse angles: cross-cultural mysticism, individual psychology, fundamental metaphysics, and each lens offers something valuable.
They're not necessarily mutually exclusive.
Not at all. They might even be complementary. Another takeaway is the importance placed on direct experience across these different frameworks, whether it's Huxley's emphasis on realization, James's focus on the felt sense of connection, or analytic idealism's grounding in consciousness itself.
And the idea that the impact of belief matters, as James stressed.
Yes, and the fundamental nature of consciousness as potentially being the bedrock of reality, as analytic idealism proposes. These are all crucial pieces to consider when thinking about the divine.
So maybe a final thought to leave people with. Something provocative.
Well, building on all this, if reality truly is fundamentally conscious, if that's the ground of our being, what does that really imply about our connection to something larger, to that ground, that universal consciousness? Perhaps the boundaries we normally perceive between self and other, between self and divine, are much more porous, more illusory than our everyday experience suggests.
Maybe we're already swimming in the ocean we're looking for.
That's one way to think about it, yes. How might we cultivate a deeper awareness of that connection, that inherent unity? That seems like a question worth pondering.
Definitely something to think about. We really encourage everyone listening to reflect on these ideas, maybe check out Huxley or James, or look into analytic idealism if it sparked your interest, and see how these perspectives resonate with your own understanding of spirituality, reality, and maybe the divine. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.